Insane, but not crazy. A Vietnam War Experience. Shade of Darkness. By Karl Arthur Spijkens. 1967 to 1968. All characters appearing in this work are fictitious. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Special dedication to the men and women of the 23rd Medical Battalion, Chu Lai, South Vietnam. Figure 1 HHQ 23rd Medical Battalion, Americal Division 1967-68. Dedicated to the men and women of our armed forces, past, present and future. Introduction. When a person does some terrible things in their life, things that seem to be utterly wasteful, stupid, or senseless, like the murder of innocent people or pets, there is split off from the norm to the evil side of the world. At least that appears to be the assessment of the world around us. Some people would say that this is a mentally ill person and in dire need of help to return their mind back to normal. Their logic is that a normal sane person would not do such a terrible and senseless thing. So what I am trying to do in this book is to illustrate how we can engage in a war that is filled with insanity, but throughout it all, we remain normal and not be crazy. Let me explain this concept by rationalizing logic used in the world today. We live in a world of views that express, decide and judge these things as being insane but not crazy. As you can gather from this logic, the distinction between evil and being mentally ill is a matter of significant concern, as for many, it is purely subjective in matter. For this purpose, crazy is linked to evil, and if the act was not evil, then we are not crazy. The world's patterns of thinking, justifying and explaining these anomalies in life are filled with biases, morals, ethics and other norms are culturally created. One major point of concern in this matter is the burden of responsibility and accountability and the correct way to a person who has done something terrible, such as committing a crime against another human being, race, or country. If a person acts from mental ill rather than evil, then it seems somewhat reasonable to regard or judge them to be not accountable for the action, or at least, to the degree the person is ill. After all, if something terrible occurs because a person suffers from a physical illness, or a mechanical failure, the person is generally and sometimes legally, not held accountable, exceptions noted. For example, immediately after doing a tour in Nam, I was stationed at Fort Knox, Kentucky at the 42nd Field Hospital as a dispensary medic. I had the privilege to have my personal vehicle on post when I had a malfunction with my car's accelerator. It got stuck and caused the car to veer out of control, almost hitting a group of officers standing on the sidewalk. Since I was driving normal when the car malfunctioned, and the fact that I didn't stomp my foot down deliberately or to press the accelerator down to speed up, I had an unexpected seizure of my ability to control it. At least, that is how the Adjutant General Attorney explained it to me. However, I was not completely vindicated of the criminal act, as I was demoted from E5 to E4 for a violation of our military code of justice. Something I didn't understand clearly, but it was much better than a criminal charge and facing charges, as that was told to me at the beginning of this investigation. Oddly, when the car rocketed down the street, smashing into another car and coming to a stop in someone's backyard after barely missing the pedestrians, I could have been charged for attempted vehicular manslaughter or other kind of crimes, as the car could have easily plowed over the officer, injuring or killing some of them. However, since I was not physically in control of my own actions, and they had no reason to think I would do such an act on purpose, I was not held morally accountable. That is, I did nothing wrong. I hope you see where I am going here, as this is all based on perceptions and subjective thinking. If a person had intentionally tried to murder this officer with a car, then that would be seen as an evil action. Unless, perhaps, the driver was mentally ill in a way that disabled him in a way comparable to a stroke, and since a stroke may cause the car to veer out of control, much like a mechanical failure, a case might be made that the driver might be as innocent as the afflicted victim. There seem to be at least two ways that a mentally ill person might be absolved of moral responsibility, at least to the degree he is mentally ill. Regardless, the person appears to be suffering from what could be classified as a perceptual or interpretative disorder or malfunction. That is, he may have mental defects that cause him to perceive and interpret reality incorrectly. For example, a person suffering from extreme paranoia might think that some stranger intends to steal his brain, even if there are no such intention. I am hoping you are staying with me as I detail how we become not just institutionalized in our thinking patterns, but also fall to the games of the establishment. In such a case, it seems reasonable to not regard the person as evil if he tries to harm someone. After all, he is acting in what he thinks is legitimate self-defense rather than from a wicked motivation. In contrast, if someone who wanted to kill me to carjack my car or just for fun would be acting in an evil way. Put in general terms, mental conditions that distort a person's perception and interpretation of reality might lead him to engage in acts of wrongful violence even though his moral reasoning might remain normal. Again, strangely, it seems sensible to consider that such people might be following their conscience as best they can, only they have distorted information to work within their decision-making process, and this distortion results from mental illness. Second, the person might be suffering from what could be regarded as a disorder of judgment. That is, the person's ability to engage in reasoning is damaged or defective due to a perceived mental illness. The person might, or might not, have correct information to work with, but the processing is defective in a way that causes a person to make judgments that would be regarded as evil if made by a normal person. For example, a person might infer from the fact that someone is wearing a blue hat that the person should be killed, or maybe in the case of the Vietnam War, a person is wearing black pajamas and therefore, should be killed. One obvious point of concern is that normal people are generally bad at reasoning, no anomaly during the war, and commit fallacies with alarming regularity. As such, there would be a need to sort out the sort of reasoning that is merely bad reasoning from reasoning that would count as being mentally ill. One point worth considering is that bad reasoning could be fixed by education and awareness, whereas a mental illness would not be fixed by learning, for example, logic, and should be treated by diagnosis and medication or therapy. A second obvious point of concern is discerning between mental illness as a cause of such judgments and evil as a cause of such judgments. After all, evil people can be seen as having a distorted sense of judgment in regards to value. In fact, some philosophers aka Kant and Socrates regard evil as a mental defect or a form of irrationality. This has some intuitive appeal. After all, people who do terrible and senseless things would certainly seem to have something wrong with them. Whether this is a moral wrongness or health wrongness is, of course, the big question here. For many war veterans, this is linked to their experiences and perception during their time of service. One of the main reasons to try to sort out the difference is figuring out whether a person should be treated, cured, or punished, which might also cure the person. As noted above, a person who did something terrible because of mental illness would, to a degree, not be accountable for the act and hence should not be punished, or the punishment should be duly tempered. For some it is tempting to claim that the choice of evil is an illusion because there is no actual free choice, that is, we do what we do because of the biochemical and electrical workings of the bodies that are us. As such, people should not be punished, rather they should be repaired. Of course, there is a certain irony in such advice. If we do not have choice, then advising us to not punish makes no sense since we will just do what we do. The adverse impact of this rationale is the fact that when you apply this to government, there is no distinction made. Government is not held accountable or responsible for what they do, carry out or engage in, especially when it comes to making war. So how do you introduce a subject as tender as the Vietnam War without offending anyone who fought this conflict with all his or her body and soul? Why would you even write about things that were so atrociously violent, brutal, mind-boggling and controversial, and what would justify speaking out against the flow of mainstream media and history books when the dust has still not settled? Controversy causes doubts of whether or not you know the truth in these matters. Can we trust the history books to tell us the truth? Perhaps to some extent, it would be the appropriate source to mention and refer to for war statistics, facts of battles, chronology, and other factual matters that verifiable by military records. If we understand the truth correctly, without the extra perceptions, was a necessary evil, or was it justified of being as close to normal as life gets? On the other hand, does the government allow the truth to be printed, or would it rather conceal the deception and lies they provided over a long period of time to justify their use of one of the world's mightiest armed forces in such a small country called the Republic of South Vietnam? As a war veteran, I mourn the loss of my teammates daily without exceptions. As a former warrior, I seek condolences and forgiveness for what I was a part of during my one-year tour as a medic. It is a fact that for over 40 years I carried a lot of guilt inside me. One such guilt was survivor's guilt, another kind of guilt was my own conscience, fighting my own morality and mortality. In the end, I suffered no more and no less than most Vietnam veterans, except that I was spared the agony of Agent Orange and other visible wounds. How I survived does not matter anymore, as that stands for the record to be satisfactory and successful in both family and career paths. What I did or underwent during my recovery time, is now, not much of an issue, as it has brought me full circle with life and my heart. There is nothing more to say except to tell the truth as I have known it to exist. Is it wrong, and does it point the blame somewhere else? Yes, I think so. I think the blame belongs to the establishment that sent us to a war that was never fully justified. At least, in my mind, that is how I see it after it was all over and done with, and as I visit the wall in DC to see the names of my fallen comrades, I realize that over 58,307 men and women lost their lives because of the bureaucracy that wanted a war fought in a foreign land under the pretense of stopping communism at the front door and not letting it be fought on American soil. The hypocrisy in this message is stronger than the truth itself. Our country shamed us into believing we fought a good war, an honorable war and a justified war. To some, including me, it was an honorable war but not a good war to be fought. This is a paradox that will never be clear to anyone who experienced this warfare. This war was full of hate, racism, class warfare, political pandering and foreign policy meddling to control the power of the world while sending young men into battle. Battles that were mostly won but not sufficient to win the war. Politics took a front seat over military victories. The entire conflict was riddled with political agendas and corporate greed that served the rich and punished the poor. Punishment that came in the form of death, injuries, maimed bodies, and screwed-up minds. So now it comes down to what we know to be an insane war fought somewhere most people today have already forgotten. Why are American soldiers who engaged in a brutal war for years being punished for their loyalty and devotion to God and country? Why does duty have such a bitter taste in my mouth, or is it the guilt that puts the salt in the wounds and cause us to suffer until eternity? It is with high hopes that after reading my book, you become somewhat better educated, aware and cognizant of how the soldier's mind was twisted, tortured, and damaged by the war and its visual, mental and physical distortions, as well as the fact that no human being can endure such an assault or onslaught on their humanity and morals without denting or impacting their reality where they have been and what they have endured. This does not mean that I am making excuses for those who became criminals under our system of laws. The laws are there for a purpose. At the same time, the laws should distinguish the difference between mental illness and evil. I believe there are too many veterans locked up in jails and prisons who are not evil but in their own world, did things that they thought were normal or without malice or indiscriminate harm towards others. Excluding those who plan or commit premeditated crimes, I believe many others are victims of a subjective prosecutor, jury, or judge who do not understand how the mind breaks down when exposed to harsh and toxic conditions day after day, year after year, without rest, sleep, a relief of psychological guilt or anxiety and more. On a case-by-case basis, we would find many veterans who served with honor during their tour of duty, who gave their all in any way they could or felt it should have been delivered or done but labeled evil and put away for crimes, punishable by many years behind bars with no chance for treatment or recovery of their own losses. Still awake at dawn. There was no reveille, there were no flags flying in the air, and the sounds of the jungle were near enough to hear the rustling and chirping of the small tropical rainforest exotic kind of animals, creeping along the edge of the green foliage and razor wire. Here, in this part of the world, the jungle was frightening. It was all so gloom and dark, even when the sun was bright and the shade trees parted. I believed it was true that even the jungle was frightened of itself when the darkness fell. You could tell by the way the foliage was shivering with terror. Nearby, a foul-smelling swamp where our human waste was being dumped after we burned it with the diesel fuel lit to fill the air with deep dark smoke. The morning fog carried its stench to where we gathered to eat as the mood is solemn. Slowly, the mild reddish-yellow and blue light filters through the clouds above, as another dawn breaks the silence of the night. The usual low-lying mist hides our camp from the sky above where the helicopters fly to make their routine reconnaissance patrols from the air. As the mist slowly lifts from the treetop levels and exposing our camp, the sun begins to heat up quickly all that is around us, living, dead, high or drunk. Already a weary soldier, barely 19 and not yet eligible to vote, I smoked a cigarette as I spent another sleepless night, inside my own flesh, hiding from the darkness. The group count was 10, we were always running short as new fucking guy, FNG, replacement came sparingly. I was the medic and we had spent the night at a base camp near the mountains, but close enough to the river that snaked through the jungle with endless twists and every turn brought another disaster. We were from the 23rd Medical Battalion, HHQ Americal Division, and we went wherever the order from HHQ told us to go. Our motto "Others May Live" was a reality of the war as I personally saw my comrades fall one after the other until my year was gone and done, returning with only 6 of the 12 comrades that came over with me in December 1967 and surviving through the Tet Offensive of 68 that took heavy casualties in this crazy war. Figure 2 Combat Medic Badge. The jungle where we now live in, is about 1 million years old or maybe more. I am guessing that this land is older than dirt and the mountains were made of limestone and marble centuries ago. The animals that roam there, usually in peace if not bothered by humans, resemble a Jurassic Park setting, and if you leave these creatures alone, they won't kill you with their bite or venom. Out here, the only doctor is the medic. A man who went to school to learn to be a carpenter but ended up wrapping bandages on the wounded and shooting men up with antibiotics because they caught the clap or other venereal disease out here. Figure 3 Valley in South Vietnam at dawn. The first thing men of combat learned was not to drink the tepid water. Poisoned by the dung of water buffaloes and other fecal waste, they are infested with the larvae of mosquitoes as fresh drinking water was scarce. But with a little bit of help from the Corps of Engineers, potable water was brought in by air or cargo plane if the base had a landing strip long enough to allow them to land. Other bases got it by tanker trucks traveling in convoys up and down the coastal highways as well as the inner roads under the watchful eyes of the MPs in charge of road protection. Otherwise, the helicopter, a Chinook, would bring it in on a hook, extra-large OD green rubber bladder water storage containers, that kept us supplied with enough to shower weekly and drink often as the water was always lukewarm or hot, because of the blazing Sunday foul to drink as the water smelled like hot rubber burning. It was the best we had under these conditions in hell. Suddenly, the quietness of the morning was broken. A harsh voice breaks through the air and screams, "Mount up, move it out, we got a mission." 5 minutes into the hurried-paced hike, we hit the foul-smelling water, crossing the swamp with our rifles overhead and our bodies exposed to leeches. Water and mud, mixed by the footsteps of our crossing, our beady eyes are focused on the other side where the sniper has the high ground and we are waiting in the deep part of the swamp, like sitting ducks. Printed messages of love and fuck the world on the helmets mounted with psychedelic graffiti and the card of an ace of spade, and a small plastic container of mosquito repellent. We hit the opposite side of the steep banks that edge the smelly swamp. Best known to others as the platoon of Gook killers, the distinction was made of combat fought before and after, the destruction of hamlets and hidden tunnels assigned to recon patrols and search and destroy groups. The journey was often fast-paced and the causalities were always high. The name of my wife was printed on my helmet, Angel. It was drawn the very first day I arrived. Neither a grunt nor a tough-looking soldier, I was drafted to enter a fight in a god-forsaken land, with no end in sight. My hair was exceptionally long according to army regulations. My short but distinguished non-regulation Fu Manchu was trimmed and kept tight. My shirt, now saturated with mud and water, was the same shirt I wore last week during the last monsoon rain and washed out by the hammering rain and dried out and bleached by the scorching sun. Figure 4 Green lush fields of South Vietnam. I carried my first aid bag over my shoulder along with a couple of bandoliers of ammunition for the others who could carry no more. My body, clinging to the wet and saturated uniform, was painted in green camouflage patterns. Something new to replace the old solid greens we had before. Hitting the banks, we see a reptile crawling as it slowly slithered back into the swamp, disappearing completely. Our eyes are peeled to the left, right, up to the top and all around. There is no peace when you are traveling like this in a pack of wolves waiting to be ambushed or exposed to the enemy that is rarely seen before the first bullet has struck. There is nothing natural or recognizable about traveling through the jungle. From a distance, especially from the view of the helicopters above, the jungle looks like a smooth green silk-woven bed sheet, laced tightly to cover the earth, but when treading on the ground, every step is laborious and every single noise or sound is a warning of danger. Within a few weeks of hitting this god-forsaken land, your own character, your so-called personality becomes unrecognizable as the war changes you into an agent from hell. The ugliness and hate, revealed so suddenly, changed a boy into a man in just a few days as he adjusts his head to deal with the dead. Figure 5. Nasty mud, smelly swamp water. Our heads tilt up, a rustle in the taller trees causes us a concern, as we halt and put our gear down. The point man, crouched and sling-wrapped on his M16 rifle, scans the area and points towards an isolated tree not far from where we were, perhaps 75 yards or so. The noise gave away a sniper. Our luck was running high, and suddenly, the guy behind me rattled the sounds of complete silence. With the vibrations of his M60 machine gun he hand-painted himself to match the jungle colors and patterns. The point man, still concerned and crouched down flat and still, moves away as he scans his eyes across the high green growth and spots another assassin hiding in ambush, waiting for us to move ahead into his line of fire. Near noon, the glimmer of the sun heats up the tropical jungle floor as we patiently wait for the word to move on as one of our own flanks the gunman and rattles the air with a burst of automatic gunfire. By the second shot, the whole jungle blazes out with automatic fire coming in from all angles. Avoiding the crossfire, we saturated the bush and made sure they were dead. Crossing the trails that were made by those who traveled here before, we spot exotic birds and reptiles in the trees and thick bushes. Figure 6. Thick South Vietnam jungle. We are certain that on any given day, this same trail is used by those who wear those black pajamas and carrying AK-47s as they move silently day and night from position to position to confuse our intelligence officers with their stealthy ways. The difference between our tracks and theirs are frighteningly different. Their sandals rarely leave prints or tracks that tells us they have been here, while our heavy boots leave the green foliage trampled and flat. A slight flicker of the hand signals the all-clear sign, and as our eyes scan the bushes, we trek lightly through the foliage across the paths, waiting and watching for the enemy to pop up and take a shot at us, just one more time. No matter how fast we walked, the enemy always walked faster. The man beside me with the American 12-gauge shotgun smiles as he chews on his gum, hard and heavy, trying to calm his nerves. All of us, clad in camouflaged rags, are anxious to stand down and rest, but the chances are slim as the mission is hurried and critical for whatever lies ahead of us, when we get there. Nobody hit, we move on down the line. The sun is heating up the jungle as we sweat profusely as our mud-stained uniforms dry only to be drenched in sweat. None of us noticed the rustling sound of the tiny brown men dressed in black, abandoning their positions and screaming and scattering into the jungle. Undetected when they hide behind the bush, what must have been a dozen gooks or so, appeared frightened and fleeing their positions in all directions. Not even 1 hour into the perilous treacherous trudge, we done seen the light of the living and the darkness of death. None of us were hit, none of us died that morning. None of the usual blood and torn flesh inflicted by the enemy, rarely seen, before the first bullet was fired. Our turn this morning to die was definitely not taken, as the black-dressed men around us laid still and thrown all around and torn to bits by the slaughter of our heavenly guided hails of bullets. It is now that see the peaceful sight, in a twisted and bizarre manner, in which we acted with joy and favor, that the enemy was dead and none of us had any more pain than had already been inflicted. Here we appeared as if we were coming out of the jungle mist that had already lifted but left behind some patches of vapors that carried the smell of death of those who wore the enemy's black and whose bodies were dripping red onto the ground. Figure 7 Muddy waters of South Vietnam jungles. Our leader was certain we had awakened the giants out there. The enemy in black, too many to count and too many to fight at once without the support of the fantastic fast low-flying Phantom F-4 jets, shattering the sounds of saneness above and loaded with napalm. We begin to move quickly with one Vietnamese scout, racing rapidly, ahead of us, passing the point man, in what seemed to be a breathlessly running for our lives and escape the trap that was set for us not too long ago. None of us started this war that was happening around us. Even those drafted felt that this war was faint at heart and hard to be won as the country, deeply divided, had fought each other for decades after decades even when France was its master. Now, on behalf of the French, we soaked our blood and sweat into the dirt that brought tears here within the group or home abroad. What was odd was the fact that to the Vietnamese, we were the intruders, the murderers, and the savages. Killing fields around us, they must have learned to run faster than our bullets, as running with sandals is hard as it is, but for them, it was fleeing or dying. There was no compromise in the matter, as they only saw the gun-toting automatic weapons foreign freaks spray their hamlets with non-discriminating bullets and primitive search and destroy methods that sought out not only the guilty, but also the innocents. So learning to move away faster and faster, to stay alive, was their way of saying they were not the enemy, but in reality, anyone fleeing was a moving target from the fields or up above. We were taught in our training that once you come to the land of Nam, you shoot and kill on sight and let God sort them out. Armed with airdropped napalm, flamethrowers, M16s mini cannons and machine guns from the sky, ammunition was plenty, they were shot on sight, incinerated by suspicion and burned by napalm in a bright psychotic-inducing orange-red flame that leaves a smell behind you never forget. Unlike the North Vietnamese or Viet Cong who tread silently, Americans trampled the ground with tanks, armored personnel carriers and troop carriers that were outrageously loud. This mood, mixed with our American-tuned fanatical desire for hearing the electrifying rock music blaring over the radios and other electronic players, all they heard were the sounds of death. In reality, there was no real difference between the orange-red flames of napalm and the intensely vivid and white and bright white phosphorus powder, that ate their skin upon contact. Once exposed, they transformed their bodies into a white heat that we could barely imagine to be alive, as it was brighter than the sun itself when it hit high noon, and with an intense frenzy, scorched us severely, drawing more heat than the guns we carried. Each time we met the enemy, there were loud explosions. The noise, shattering the silence that existed right before the storm, and as the day begins to cool down for the evening, we are moving toward the light of the center of our world to find a safe place to spend the night, aware of the enemy that seeks out to do the same to us as we do to them. A light that is hidden by the eclipsed darkness of death and gloom, surrounding us each and every night. This account is neither a confession or a crime. We followed orders, and that was a matter of fact, as we were told that it was us versus them, and to stay alive, we needed to fire first and ask questions afterwards. This is also not a repentance for any sins committed at that time. Although none were coerced or forced into battle, we took our mission seriously and made sure that whoever departed the base camp came back alive. Today, the count of American deaths either killed in action or missing stands at over 58,307 and counting. On the other side, the death toll is atrociously higher. Between the North Vietnam Army and the Viet Cong, the fatality rate was well over 1.1 million soldiers. On the civilian side, it has been estimated that over 3.2 million people were caught in this war, and in the end, the country remained divided but under one government, the government of North Vietnam. The military and boom boom. Vietnam is a beautiful place on earth, covered with clouds, lush green fields, and when viewed from the sky, it looked even more beautiful until you set foot on the ground and moved closer to the stench of death and misery it brought to those who wanted to go back to the real world alive. None of us thought of this as a pleasure trip, some had done more than one tour and made it through alive. Without exception, none of us had ever seen a Saigon boom boom street. We had heard there were streets lined with bars and shops set up for American soldiers and our allies. For us, the city of Da Nang and the surrounding towns were the only places where we saw dealings open for trade on the black market or other goods sold to the American troops. For a small donation, you could travel by rickshaw or motorbike to any part of the city and get laid by one of the girls for hire to give the soldiers the pleasure of sex they left behind in the free world. Whether in uniform or dressed in casual civilian clothes, we rarely traveled the streets around our base camp. Littered with prostitutes carrying every venereal disease there is, as a medic I knew how bad it really was by the number of men lined up for med call to get their shots of penicillin or substitute if they were allergic to the antibiotic. Nearby, there was a base PX where you bought your luxuries and get a haircut or shoes shined as the villagers sold you many things. Kids running around with their hands out flat asking you to give them anything you have to feed them or give them something they can take back to their parents. Unfortunately, there were many orphans running around for these handouts and none were too proud to ask or beg for food, cigarettes, candy, or gum. The only bars allowed to walk into here were small thatched bars with just enough amenities to call it such a place. The bar, littered with bar stools, a single countertop, a linoleum floor, maybe a few tables and chairs, and yet, they had the blissful opportunity to have a jukebox. It was often empty unless the weather is bad enough to stand down all operations, and as the perimeter guards are set, others take a break and soothe their souls with alcohol, wine, or beer. They were not very choosy here. Anything was better than drinking water. What was so special about the bars was the drinks provided and available other than water. Once, working with a track squadron of the 1st Squadron of the 1st Armored Cavalry, I remember popping hot beer inside their armored personnel carriers and how good hot beer tasted compared to the rubber-smelling water. The reality is that when you don't have plenty of clean water, you try to moisten your mouth any way you can in this heat. Figure 8 dirty water pills. Some chewed on bamboo shoots, some dropped their purification tablets in rainwater, river shit water, you know, stuff right out of the filthy rice paddies, but when in town, or on base, it's beer and anything cold that they serve. Nobody gave it any more thought that this dirty water had been contaminated with a chemical called Agent Orange and that it caused more sickness and more deaths that will ever be revealed by its maker or the government. As a medic, I carried water purification tablets in my medic bag and often filled canteens up with these tablets to make sure the water was drinkable or suitable without the side effects of dysentery, diarrhea, etc. that can slow a group down quicker than anything else. The Halazone tablets were sized so 2 tablets, dissolved in a full 1-quart canteen, would disinfect the water. Halazone was a component of individual and group first aid kits, supplied to U.S. forces until after World War II, at which time iodine tablets became the standard for military use. Halazone continued in use through the Vietnam War at least. The shelf life of Halazone is about 2 years from date of manufacture. Even while sitting in the smoke-filled shaded bar, a dark-colored Huey roars overhead as it heads its way toward the mobile helipad where the casualties are unloaded for the surgical hospital located here right off the beach. Even the bars are surrounded by sandbags and barbed wire as it sits securely on a heavily fortified base camp that has been subject to many attacks since the Tet Offensive began. Every time it rained, the helicopters were grounded, and although the bars made good business on rainy days, the perimeter was always vulnerable to booby trap carrying Viet Cong who sacrificed themselves to blow up any American they could find in their cowardly attacks on the base. In the free world, aka real world, you would never find a person carrying a rifle or handgun inside a bar. Here, the necessity to stay alive allowed exceptions to such rules, and it was common to see armed men jump from helicopters and head straight to the bar. Another reality was that most men here were barely men, kids by age but grown men by the baptism of fire and hell. There was no drinking age limit here. If you can walk into the joint, you got yourself a beer or any alcoholic beverage you had funds to buy right there and now. No ID, just a uniform and a heart that was still beating. Because there was no limit on what you could buy, it was often best to partner up on those nights you went drinking inside these bars. And thus we come to Vietnam, young, wild and stupid, and the first thing we look for is a place to drink, and the second place is a place that has prostitutes for a passionate session of boom boom with a Vietnamese woman. To some, the spoils of war include wild bars and wild women. The unspoken truth that where there is war, there are women for sale, is considered to be a necessary provision, much like water, food, and shelter. So these young men have reached the crossroads of being healthy bodies able to fight and at the same time drink beer, soda pop, and ice cream when the supply was there. Happy and healthy men make great fighters, and the government was glad to oblige. By the time the Americans had fully replaced the French in Indochina, the social upheaval of bars and prostitution reached a high during the war. Since the Civil War, long ongoing and with no sign of ending anytime soon, disrupted the South Vietnamese economy and society to the point where people were bankrupt or had lost everything the war had taken from them. Because of their war-caused poverty, it was necessary to legitimize prostitution, as families were desperate and therefore, routinely made their wives, daughters, and other female family members perform such sex acts for the soldiers as they sold their women because they needed the money. In fact, prostitution increasingly became the only viable economic solution for thousands of South Vietnamese women. One such societal source stated that the miserable conditions of war have forced our people to sell everything, their wives, children, relatives, and friends, for the American dollar. The American military command got into the prostitution business by default. As they escalated the war, they saw a need to escalate the prostitution business. Their justification was based on the fact that men at war required sex, and that meant the solicitation for more women as prostitutes. Hence we saw an increase of military-sponsored brothels on base, as well as other natural outgrowths of such behaviors. In the McNamara theory, it was stated, in 1965 the main idea was to keep the troops contented and satisfied. Ice cream, movies, swimming pools, pizza, hot dogs, laundry service, and hooch girls. The hooch maid were brought in as girls, not as prostitutes. Sex with a hooch maid was a private arrangement, a relationship of convenience. Figure 9. Boom boom venereal diseases. A lot of hooch girls did become prostitutes, however, but in the early days if they were discovered at it, they were fired. The hooch girls were the first step toward accommodations. Bar girls and massage parlors soon followed. According to some sources, the rear area troops caused the most problems. There was a lot of discontent and boredom. The men were aware that they were becoming garrison troopers or soldiers who weren't fighting, who weren't getting any medals. They might drive into town to the illegal brothels, but for reasons of VD and security the brothels were off limits. Hence, an alternative to all this boom boom activity was created and founded right on the military compound, where the men were safe and the women were plenty. For example, in Pleiku, the Lai Kyi recreation area belonging to the base camp of the 3rd Brigade, 1st Infantry Division, was a 1-acre compound surrounded by barbed wire with American military policemen standing guard at the gate. It was opened only during daylight hours for security reasons. Inside the compound there were shops that sold hot dogs, hamburgers, and souvenirs, but the main attraction was 2 concrete barracks, each about 100 feet long, the military whorehouses that serviced the 4,000-man brigade. Each building was outfitted with 2 bars, a bandstand, and 60 curtained cubicles in which the Vietnamese women lived and worked. This concept spread throughout South Vietnam, and for those men who were assigned to infantry or armored units in combat with an occasional stand-down, there were accommodations for them to visit the bars and screw the women. Military brothels on army base camps, Sin Cities, Disneylands or boom boom parlors, were built by decision of a division commander, a 2-star general, and were under the direct operational control of a brigade commander with the rank of colonel. Clearly, Army brothels in Vietnam existed by the grace of Army Chief of Staff William C. Westmoreland, the United States Embassy in Saigon, and the Pentagon. As a medic, this made my job much harder on the off time rather than combat, as there was a plague-like outbreak of venereal diseases that had serious consequences for those infected. Figure 10. Artist version of the CMB. Venereal disease, mostly gonorrhea, was a major preoccupation of the military in Vietnam. One official brothel outside Saigon had a sign on the wall of the bar that read, "Girls with tags are clean girls." Before anyone jumps to conclusions about bars, there were no restrictions on what they sold to us, as long as it was approved by the military. Hell, they even shipped or ferried beer via helicopter to the outside, more remote areas, so the grunts could drink both soda pop and beer, even when hot. This was to accommodate those who couldn't get to the base camp or towns around the military installations. Since most of my time was out in the boonies, with rare or seldom trips to the large base camps, we got our beer by air delivery most of the time. Sometimes we were lucky to have ice and sometimes we didn't. During my time, they sold American beer and Australian beer in the areas where we worked out of in the I Corps in Da Nang, Chu Lai, Quang Tri, and Quang Nam provinces. Most of the beer on the more remote bases were gathered by collections of the group and 1 or 2 persons drive to the town to make a beer run. Some beers I remember being available in country that year. Pabst Blue Ribbon, Carling Black Label, Budweiser. I even had some Ballantine beer that in my opinion was likened to drinking piss water. Something that was odd and required the possession of a church key at all times was that all of the cans of beer that we got over there were the old style, pre-pop top, cans that required a can opener, A/K/A church key, even though pop tops had been in widespread use in the US for several years. As for the local Vietnamese stuff, there was Ba Mui Ba, beer 33, which came in a bottle about the size of a US 12 ounces, and tasted okay because it would be chilled in the bar rather than hot out in the fields, and another local beer called commonly as Tiger Beer, but was actually named Beer LaRue, and usually came in a 1-liter bottle. This stuff was very inconsistent in quality. Some bottles tasted bitter, some like formaldehyde, and even vinegar. For the most part, cold beer or hot beer was always a good thing to come back to after a hard day in the field dragging ammo or other gear around under the hot unforgiving sun. Figure 11 hot or cold Ballantine beer. When you spent the day, plodding through dirty water, and refusing to drink that, even with a purification pill in your canteen, a beer or soda pop was a pleasure that was priceless. Having anything else to drink besides dirty water was as close to heaven as we were going to get under most circumstances for infantry or armor grunts waiting for the sun to go down. At chow time, we switched to soda, as we always went out on roving patrols or set up ambushes at night, or else manned the bunkers at heavily steel-plated reinforced sandbag fort. We also had one about ground glass in beer. When you bought a bottle you were supposed to put your thumb over the top and turn it upside. If there was glass in it, you would see it glittering as it fell through the beer. Figure 12 Vietnam American-made beer. This applied only to local bought Vietnamese beer, Ba Mui Ba, means 33, mostly. American beer that they bought on the black market and sold to us at vastly inflated prices was almost always in cans and was the preferred way to drink beer unless you were very comfortable with the bar you were visiting, as most of us had a regular hangout when the outfit was on stand-down status. Out here a man holds on to whatever he can. Sometimes this war does crazy things to the mind and they flip out. The constant downpours of rain, the overwhelmingly hot sun, the mud, the nights, and the war by itself, is enough to drive a good man crazy. When not in combat, a man has too much time to think. Sometimes, hope and despair replace the monotony of the war and brings an evil spirit that is self-destructive with either the use of alcohol or drugs, or in many cases, both. Staring into space, bright stars, or torrential rains coming down hard like bricks, a man can get lonely and just stare into space, swallowing the pain of the day and hoping to wake up tomorrow. A team is only as good as the amount of supplies and water it can get when on the move. I remember about 6 months ago, I was with a group up north, and when we were stalled on a bridge, not too far from the nearest MP checkpoint, I saw a man shoot himself in the head. Running over to treat him, he was dead before I got to him. I motioned for help to take his body back to the MP checkpoint, and as we carried his body to an MP jeep and laid him down on a makeshift litter, I wondered what would make a man crazy enough to shoot himself in the middle of a peaceful night. Figure 13 Map of South Vietnam 67-70. Maybe, sometimes, peace is not what is it cracked up to be to someone living in a dying world. Even on a peaceful night, where combat has taken a pause for a couple of hours during the darkness, you can hear and feel the rolling thunder of the B-52 bombers in the sky. Like a small earthquake, under your feet, the earth moves with just a gentle tug or tremor, and there is a slow buffeting feeling that shakes you a little as the wind picks up a bit and the night is interrupted with loud claps of thunder. All you can do is stop whatever you are doing and watch the sky as you gaze miles over the green jungle and beyond, white flashes, and sudden silence. In the distances you can view arches of light. Every time a bomb hits the ground, the earth shakes and the sky lights up with an arch of light, sometimes too many to count. On your end of the shaking thunder, even from a distance, you know something bad is going to happen. It never fails when the night is interrupted by the noise from up above. No smoke, no fumes, no warning. The distance is alarming, but by morning, the news will travel fast on what they hit and where they are going to hit next. A slight roaring noise came down from the air, up high, past the forming clouds and barely visible. You can see the black silhouettes of two pair of B-52s, their vapor trails streaming white against the darkened sky. No use in looking up, for whatever happened up there has nothing to do with what you have down here. Other than causing some damage to the target area, these bombs fall unnoticed after you have heard them a time or two. Using the red lenses on the flashlights, this is a good time to write some letters home. Some haven't written home for over 3 months, others write every time we camp and fold the paper up to stuff an envelope the first chance they get when close to a mailbox or supply delivery by air or by truck. They are first in line to get their letters home to the real world. Our team leader appears dedicated and regular Army. He is a fresh second lieutenant but well disciplined, unlike those who graduated from the officer candidate school back a few months ago. OCS is an acronym for the dead. Those who went through OCS rarely made great first impressions. Unless they had served time as an enlisted man, it was a hard adjustment, and for some, it was a most stressful and problematic road to travel past their time of tour duty, as some were either killed in action or killed by friendly fire. Figure 14: a hand grenade to frag an officer. Only the good survive out here. He had to be a fine officer, a man with dignity, respect, and command presence. If his background was good, he will lead well. Others aren't so lucky. Some come into the field with fancy degrees of studying humanities and arts and sciences. The adjustment that has to be made was sometimes fatal. Conflicts between seasoned sergeants and second lieutenants were common, as one command was often challenged by newcomers. It was a dynamic that was more than often fatal for somebody in the vicinity of such conflicts. All this doesn't help you a damn bit when you are trying to stay alive under the utmost extreme conditions possible. Many came out of college with a degree and a set of butter bars to lead the squad or command a team. Other than the radio man, as the medic, I stayed close to his left as his sergeant is always on his right. The radio man, always in the middle. The radio man, always vulnerable and easily distracted as he mans the field comms during the time there is peace or turmoil. Regardless, he has to communicate everything the lieutenant shares with him and relay that information back to the other end. Throughout the day, they act as one and neither knows what the other is thinking. It's all spontaneous and reactive as the calls are made to direct an artillery or mortar fire, helicopter support or dust off, medevac, landings and napalm drops to prevent the enemy from overrunning the position entrenched or directed to hold or defend no matter what. OCS and leadership. He views his military career as a brilliant move to boost his self-importance. A public demonstration of his dedication, of his talents to bringing American values and way of life to the forefront and lead others into victory. Sarcasm. Such was the impression taken by the enlisted men who had already been in country for a while and now under the command of a new platoon leader due to rotation or a recent KIA. Almost immediately after completing the officer candidate school 90-day course, he is shipped to those darker, less fortunate areas of the world, with a real shot of reality where he leaves the real world behind and takes command of a group of young men in battle, some already battle-ready and molded to be America's best fighters. The challenge before him is easy: lead or get out of the way. Side aside his past liberal politics and humanitarian concerns for society. This is the Army, and here, men die because others can't take command or make sound decisions. Figure 15 OCS logo, Officer Candidate School. As the men watch him closely in battle, they quickly determine if he has the mettle to be courageous or if his face turns blank and vacant of what to do next. If his eyes turn empty, his soul has died, as confirms to his troops, he has failed to adjust to the heat of battle around him. There will be a time when the fragging of an officer will bring the group to the reality that something is dreadfully wrong with their leadership, and before he can hurt or get someone killed, he needs to be taken out of the action by whatever means available at the time. If and when such a tragedy appears, it could be a day of mourning for an American officer killed in action either by friendly fire or a deliberate attempt to remove him from command so others may live. The term fragging may sound strange or weird to anyone who didn't fight in a war where officers and their men were deemed expendable if they failed to lead their troops. The word fragging was developed during the Vietnam War, when increasing numbers of combat troops used fragmentation grenades to kill officers determined to be possessed with inadequate in leadership skills or capabilities, or just plain dangerous to be around when the hostilities began. Fragging refers to the killing of officers, military leaders, while at war. One former officer who narrowly escaped the receiving end of a grenade fragging in the Vietnam War, tells a story that his life is forever altered by that explosion. It was intended for him, but instead killed 2 other soldiers, and still causes him great distress, in the form of post-traumatic stress disorder. 90-day wonders, as many second lieutenants were called after graduating, often had to withstand 2 tests under fire. Those of the enemy and those of his own men. The reasons behind such rash decisions may vary, ranging from cowardice, to revenge, to insanity, and countless things in between. Historical data points to PTSD as a primary reason in many cases, referring to the endless number of human beings who break down in war, sometimes with disastrous results. In some cases, officers in war really are poorly placed. There is the phenomenon of the 90-day wonder, which is the amount of time the military requires to transform a college graduate into a military figure who instantly outranks every enlisted person in the entire military, generally at the age of 22. Some will tell you that at times, fragging was selected to prevent an officer from leading combat forces to certain death. Inasmuch as human behavior has not changed for thousands of years, it is easy to appreciate that this problem has existed in all facets of the military in all nations and not exclusive to the American troops. Figure 16 U.S. Army. It was later declared that the Army in Vietnam was dispirited where not near mutinous in an article titled The Collapse of the Armed Forces. It was the corroboration of the belief that military leaders themselves recognized a crisis. In this widely accepted opinion, it seems clear that the level of training and development significantly impacted the attitude and motivation of the service member. The nature of the war itself was a heavy contributor to the madness inside a man's head or heart. The consistent dynamic between Vietnam and other wars is that each saw the standards for enlistment drop well below the requirements of peacetime years. Combined with the draft, this produced many behavioral problems in the Vietnam War, including an increase in fragging as the years passed. Accidental homicide translates as accidental death. It is a term or code the military usually tags situations of describing friendly fire. There was quite a bit of friendly fire in Vietnam, mostly due to a lack of communication. Although it is hard to say who did what for whatever reason, there were hostilities where guys were shot down by their own helicopter on a support flight or caught in a crossfire and being too close to a drop zone where napalm or white phosphorus was used, killing them accidentally. It's because target identification was very weak, and this combined with the lack of communication between base and field unit is a recipe for disaster. What is unique about these friendly fire situations are the chances or opportunities for enlisted men to target freshly commissioned officers aka OCS second lieutenants, during the hostilities and, for a lack of a better word, assassinate their leader for their displeasure of leadership skills or other type of command conflicts. The war would be unjustly talked about if we didn't mention that most of the OCS officers turned out to be great leaders. The perception of the enlisted men of their leader was subjective and most of the time, unfairly spoken, as this was a natural divide between officer and troops. It was the sergeant that had to link the two together. It was the sergeant who had to mold, train, or mentor the new officer of his duties and responsibilities as it was normal a non-commissioned officer, NCO, such as AE6 or higher took command while the unit waited for a new leader. Our team was fortunate to have good leaders. There were no ideals of mutiny or resentment in our group. The NCOs treated him with respect and respect was given. On the other side of the war were the regular South Vietnamese army officers who treated their men like shit and rules with intimidation. We had no respect for such men as they abused their troops, often leading them into battle and then backing out quicker than they advanced, leaving most of their men behind to be killed or captures. We had witnessed many such atrocities where command was abandoned because of cowardice or plain yellow streaks. Working as a team was especially hard because of the cultural diversity and differences in leadership styles, priorities, and respect. Some of these ARVN troops were hard fighters. Courageous and skilled in combat unlike their pompous leaders, but without leadership, it is hard to win battles. Relying on ARVN troops to back us up at times, relied on the talent and courage of their leader. Regardless, the team concept rarely worked well enough to depend on them as an ally or as a source of strength when the odds were stacked against us by the enemy. Black smoke rising in the distance as someone says out loud, "Secondary smoke, something is going down out there." No sooner those words were spoken when a large group of helicopters come into view, rotor blades chopping away at the air. Closer and closer, the blades get louder and louder. The sky is filled with Hueys, lots of them. Knowing from habit, we knew we were about to enter a dynamic situation. As always, when the smoke clears after such an attack, there is nothing much left of whatever the target was, as it left behind a field of devastation and destruction. Explosives launched demolished and smashed once tall standing palm trees and left huge deep ripped up craters in the ground as gutted and inflamed stray-like huts burn and bodies lying spread out on the ground. About halfway towards the impacted area, they are met by a heavily armed group carrying their wounded back to the first aid stations in the rear. Figure 17 Hueys. Overhead, 4 F-4 Phantoms and 2 Cobra gunships swoop by and taking a position to fire their rockets into the target area. The place is bedlam and the noise is drowning out any attempts to communicate the situation. As we get closer, the smell of the napalm sends a shiver down our backs as it was a cruel reminder of other such attacks in the past. Having no idea what this ruckus is all about, we continued to hike down the trail, wondering what we would find when we got closer. Obviously, this was not part of a plan to include us in the battle. By mere unplanned circumstances, we become bystanders of a major attack on a village suspected of harboring the enemy. Grouping up tight in a small circle, we crouched down low and waited for the all-clear signal to be given. No advancement, just waiting. Behind us, 3 Hueys swoop in low level and land. Heavily armed with their side door machine guns, they carefully land one at a time. As one landed, the others hover making sure the landing zone is secure and safe. A makeshift LZ is always hot. Even when you have friendlies on the ground, these pilots treat every landing such as this as a hot LZ under fire. The landing helicopter swooshes the air and stirs up the green foliage and lots of dust. One by one, they land and cut off their rotors and blades to an idle speed. Other than the 2 well-armed men jumping out, the Hueys were empty. Strange that such a landing was so close to us. As the 2 men approach the team leader and as they talk, we watched closely. One of the armed men wore a green beret while the other a regulation helmet. Both were dressed in camo uniforms and both were Americans. As the rotor wash subsides, they stood there, one with his hands on his hips and the other one, wearing mirror-like sunglasses, talks to the team leader. Suddenly, the team leader bellowed out an order to the sergeant. "Clear that tree line, Sarge, and cut us back about a safe zone of 100 yards. Give these guys a little room to breathe and relax." Sarge pointed at 5 men and as they scattered, taking their position, I remained with the radio man and the team leader. We had no idea what was happening, but whatever it was, it seemed important. As the officers talked, we tried to listen, but we were almost out of hearing distance when gunfire erupted and the smoke from a mortar round filled the air. Figure 18 dragonflies in the air. The rotors began to swirl the air, the Hueys are ready and roaring. Takeoff is imminent as helicopters sitting still make pretty easy targets. In the distance artillery booms and our team leader is looking a map. Just as sudden the Hueys arrived, they are gone leaving us behind. Why the hell there were 3 of them is anybody's guess, but whatever it was, they told our team leader to pack up and move out to another target. The tree line secured, the 5 men hurried back to the center circle. Out here it was talk as you go, no special arrangement to discuss the battle plans, but as the time came to know what we were up against, the need to know became clearer. Lately, there haven't been many boring moments as the war came closer and closer, with time remaining in country well over 5 months to go. The team tightened the circle as the lieutenant spoke out loud. He said, "Seems like the captain got himself killed early this morning. These guys were telling me he got fragged by some grunt who rolled a grenade inside his tent. We need to regroup and head back to our base and figure out what we are going up against in the next few days, so until then, sit tight, listen to your leaders and watch each other's backs." A silence fell over the group. Another good man down by the hands of one of our own. This war was driving men to insanity, and the killing would never stop as long as they had access to bullets, guns, grenades, or explosives. A good night's rest and an early before the sun came up morning wake-up call started the day off with rations and shaves, no showers, just the sea rations and maybe a shave for some. Nothing prettier in the morning than helicopters coming in at the break of dawn and stirring up the fresh misty air like an air conditioner blowing a cool breeze. What seemed like a dozen or maybe 2 long lines of Hueys standing, their rotors slowly whapping and churning the morning air briskly, we began loading the ammo and supplies into these mobile flying machines. Whatever it was we were doing, it appeared heavy duty. The number of combat troops engaged was insurmountable and too many to count. This had to be a major plan. Looking around, everybody was dressed for battle. At times like this, you just felt mean, and a mean motherfucker you were. Whether you are the door gunner or the grunt hanging out with your rifle in your lap, you feel nasty, despicable, and arrogant. Even the radio man it pumped up. This is going to be a good day, or so we hoped. Heavily armed and loaded, we boarded the helicopter as their long and short blades and rotors speed up and their gas turbines belch their fire and gas from behind. Figure 19 loaded for bear. Dust flies around in a swirling motion, as we rise and take off into a direction where none of us know where we are going. Quickly, these Hueys go into an attack formation and wander off into the distance. From the inside of the helicopter the noise is deafening as there was no small talk, just staring at the ground and waiting. Like dragonflies in the air, we danced off into nowhere. Below they see the jungle whisk by and then boom, we are suddenly over the ocean, low and fast. Peering at each other from helicopter to helicopter, you can't help but see the rockets strapped on their sides and their miniguns in locked positions and ready to fire as we near the enemy somewhere in the distance from here. The lead helicopter shows the rest the way. Wearing all this fearsome weaponry, it looks like this was going to be a big dance coming up sooner than we wanted. It was time for action, nervous, excited, adrenaline pumping, and some of us, really scared. In the midst of it all, we fondle our rifles, grenade launchers, our explosives, mortar and grenades, and our flamethrowers. Loaded up with claymores and plastic explosives, we were loaded for bear, and the M60 on the doors made us feel just a little bit safer. In this war, all you get is about 60 seconds of honor and peace, the rest is crazy. Nothing else to do but relax while riding the sky and lean out and what the ground as you are flying over the white sands of the coastline and back into the dense jungles that were not more than perhaps a few thousand feet from the shore and the waves. The word is out, we'll come down low out of the rising Sunday. The formation turns a steep bank into a tight turn as the attack formation heads for the green dense jungle below our dangling feet. Time for action. The air mobile troop carriers roar over low, engaging in battle as the helicopter rocks and shakes from the rockets fired. The sudden commencement of firing all this armament caused the whole copter to shake as we get a full view of our target. A fairly large-sized hamlet built along a river, with rice paddies and tall palm trees all around it. This village was identified as an enemy stronghold. Here there was intel that they were storing weapons and supplies for the enemy supported by these villagers. What we didn't expect to see were NVA regulars scrambling about. Mixed with the natives, they were easily identified as regular uniformed soldiers and not tribesmen or civilians. Men in cockpits screamed orders, as we see men and women run from huts bearing ammunition and rifles. Everywhere there appears to be resistance building to defend this village from the airborne troops ready to land and jump from the Hueys. Figure 20 securing the area. The scene was about to get crazier, as we watch them pull the camouflage covers from their mortar and artillery emplacements. What must have been a number of about 200 people or more, each of them, scrambling feverishly to fire their weapons at us, while we wait for the chance to land into this hot LZ with NVA and Viet Cong all around us. Feeling like sitting ducks in a shooting gallery, the miniguns pour streams of lead and tracers towards the moving targets on the ground. As the lead gunship banks steep and fires their rockets, the others stream fire from their doors, pods, and nose guns. The is saturated with fire and smoke. The village burns and the enemy run as fast as they can before being hit by the fire from up above them. Shooting back, we bank sharply over the trees and turn around. The sound of the blades whirling loudly could barely be heard over the explosions below. The door gunner fires the M60 frantically, spraying bullets everywhere it could reach. We are ripped by bullets, as our door gunner was hit and pieces of the helicopter were blown away. Still in the attack formation, each ship swoops down with its machine guns blazing and firing into the village. On the radio you can hear the most feared words, "We're down, we're hit. This is a hot LZ here and need cover." Bullets hit the plexiglass of the helicopters. We fire back and take the fight to the enemy the best we can. It seemed most of the ground fire was coming from the tree line. On the radio you can hear the call that brought 4 swift flying Hell's Angels towards the tree line as green smoke marked the target. Figure 21 white phosphorus explosion. Suddenly, a group of 4 low-flying F-4 Phantoms came in low and dropped their napalm and white phosphorus on the tree line, giving us a brief break in the hostile fire. Still hot, the LZ was temporarily secured as men hit the ground quickly. Just as fast as we could set a foot, with the Hueys refusing to land and hovering slightly about the ground, we jumped in as quickly as we deployed. The enemy had run off and headed for well-concealed trenches and tunnels. Now we had to search and destroy them at their advantage, as they were well hidden and we knew they booby-trapped the village before they ran off. Figure 22 WP or white phosphorus. The enemy were acting like they were savages. These fucking gooks are the fucking savages. That's how you justify the end for them. Making them less than human makes it easier to pull the trigger and pull down a hailstorm of chemicals on their asses. Right or wrong, that's the frame of mind when the heat gets unbearable and something has to give. So if there are any questions left over, it's them who started this war, not us. In this war business, days turn into night and night turns into day. Sometimes they run together so long, you don't know what time it is or where you are. You depend on someone else to keep you sane and coherent enough to do your job, but without a doubt, you will be jabbering nonsense and carry a heavy burden on your shoulder if you let someone next to you die. The jets streak by the ground, flying low and laying in huge gobs of orange napalm along the trees. Someone gets on the radio and suggests another run with cannon fire to make sure it's all secured and calm down there. The madness is chaos and the battle is not even halfway over. We circle the village, being careful of booby traps and crossfires. Radio was busy as I hustle to treat the wounded. Team leader is screaming for cover as the RTO tries to get somebody's attention on the radio. Our group gets caught by heavy automatic weapons fire and stalls out the movement. Figure 23 so others may live, dust off. Dust off is called for as the wounded needing to be airlifted out of here, but unless a miracle happens, those helicopters won't land on a hot LZ unless they are crazy. Fortunately for us, many of these copter pilots were crazy enough to land and give us the chance to load the wounded under heavy fire, and as they sit and wait, only an act from God keeps them alive and from blowing up with hostile rounds coming in heavy from the trenches and huts about 50 yards to the left and right. The Hueys that dumped us off are now in the air with door gunners leaning out of their doors firing their machine guns at anything that moves. On the radio, you can hear the call, "We are here above you, we are right above you and we will hold the cover." The door gunner unleashes a rapid fire of bullets and tracers. It's daylight and the tracers can't be seen very well, but it's always a beautiful sight to know they are on our side. The lieutenant screams for some explosives. The group gets peppered by AK-47 fire and they are not nice. The Sarge yells out, "The trees, hit the trees up high. No higher, shoot higher." The team leader tells the RTO to ask for cover and fire on those trees. The tree line is saturated with gooks and enemy soldiers. Hardcore regular army soldiers who fight till the death. The RTO tells the gunships to spray the tree line. He gets a wonderful response telling us they still have a few rockets left. Up above us, swooping in low and out of the smoke come two Hueys blasting the tree line with everything they got. Damn smoke gave them temporary cover and now other copters joined in the fray. Finally, the entrenched NVA and VC break and run into the distance. Another fucking fight we won, but the casualties were high for this operation. As a medic, my attention is all on those wounded who are calling for me. Screaming the words "Doc" and "Dutch" tells me they need medical attention ASAP. We scream, they scream, we all scream as the madness accelerates into insanity. As the gunships turn their attention on the fight, the medevac helicopters came in low and took the wounded. It's all about timing. Most hit were small arms fire, and although there were too many gut wounds, I managed to dress them all and get them aboard. The medevac copters were so valuable to us. From the moment someone was hit, we could stop the bleeding, load them up quickly, so they can hit the surgical table as soon as 15 to 30 minutes after being boarded. We all knew these helicopters were saving a lot of lives in this war. You had to wonder, what would we do without them? Figure 24 Dust off, medevac copter. Treating the wounded gave me no time to fire back at any enemies or hostile targets. The fact is, a medic is purely someone who comes along for the ride to save lives. Nothing more, and nothing less. As the smoke clears, someone hands me my rifle. I dropped back where I took care of my first casualty. Some head wounds are going to be lasting even after they are healed, as many wounds are invisible and not noticed by anyone who might not know where these guys have been. There was some fumbling with the rifle as I took it from my team member. As he passed it, my hands were shaking. Too much adrenaline, too much blood, and too little time to get it all done. In the free world or real world, some would be amazed at these combat situations and how they are twisted into pure stages of hell. For those moments in hell, soldiers run through the burning village screaming and firing and throwing grenades at anything that resembles an enemy body. Figure 25 Loading wounded into copter. This war is far from over, but the day is hot and humid, causing more men to succumb to the heat than the battle itself. I pass around the water and ask the RTO to get me more from anywhere they can find it. Water is like gold out there. Nobody cares too much for water until it runs out or no longer available in the 120-degree heat of the day. By now the LZ cooled off and safe to wander around. Men shake their heads as they gather their senses. Soon another relief group will show up and they'll move in as we move out. For the moment, we own this piece of real estate, and as the village is cleared of booby traps and explosives, a team goes out to check out the tunnels and secure this area for a short while. Nothing lasts forever in this country, nothing is ever the same as it was before, but on the other hand, nothing has changes because it doesn't matter. My team leader asks me if I am done with the men as I nodded affirmative and packing my medic bag up. Softly he said, "Take a walk over there for me and check out those blindfolded VC and NVA troops and see if they need any medical help. I am sure some of them over there need your first aid stuff you got in that bag and get them fixed up." I gave them a few more minutes to round them all up as they were scattered everywhere, torn to pieces and demoralized from the loss of the battle. In the distance, we hear occasional pursuit gunfire, sporadic and insignificant as the occasional mortar rounds tells the others they are aiming at those troops who fled. Walking over to the prisoners, I sort them out, and as one screams due to a fractured leg, I set the man's pain with silence as I shot him up a dose of morphine to calm him down. Out here the rules are clear: treat your own first, get them on the medevac, and then, when the hostilities subsided, treat the enemy's wounded. Another gook screams as one of the other medics look at him. What appears to be a broken arm and head wound was dressed and treated. The body count was going to be in the high numbers. Small's arms fire-inflicted wounds were plenty. Most wounds were shrapnel wounds or lacerations from flying debris. Guessing there were probably 150 dead bodies lying there, scattered over a half of an acre lot. The body count was the most important part of the war, as that was the fear factor. The press loved it and the psych ops used it to brag about how we are winning this war. Once treated, these wounded men and women were gathered up for interrogation and marched away. 3 freshly painted olive drab green colored unmarked Hueys roared in, fanning the dust and smoke with their machine-made wind. The center gunship carried intelligence officers coming in to do the interrogations. Each had their own interpreter and picked their victims one at a time, separating them from the rest. One was a full bird, a colonel, who resembled the same man with the mirrored sunglasses of the day before. Surrounded by his personal security detail, 2 heavily armed men, he walked over to the wounded and took 2 of the enemy wounded soldiers into custody and led them into the helicopter they arrived in, and took off into the sky without saying a word. I walked across the debris-strewn ground with my medic bag and sought out more wounded. As I walked from American soldier to the enemy soldier, I looked for wounds that were being ignored by those refusing medical attention. At times like this, when the battle has ceased for just a few moments, a medic's call is to treat all that are injured, regardless of what side they fought on during the battle. Figure 26 wounded being treated by medic and others. So for the most part, my experiences with officers and leadership were under fire and under the utmost extreme positions. How these men act, think and decide what action to take under such tremendous pressure says a lot about their character, their courage, and their skills. Nobody believes that every man is a hero, the same way we feel not every man is a coward. Most of our traits are brought out under the baptism of fire, and how you act, respond, or behave under hostile fire makes you able to cope with the impossible most of the time. No hero was ever made from not doing his job. Not every job assigned was never enough to be called a hero when surviving the madness is the first priority in life. For in the matter of survival, every man fought for his own and others' life. Their devotion to fight with all their strength and power was based on their desire to live. In this war, everybody contributed to the insanity and walked the fine line between hell and the real world. Most of us, who survived the insanity, learned and adapted to deal with the horrors of life and death, while enduring the feelings that resembles not being crazy in order to find some peace of mind. Figure 27 War is Hell. 1.